Hi all, and welcome to the cabin. Today we're taking another look at the rules of Warzone Eternal, the new skirmish miniatures game from Res Nova. In the last video we went through the basics, and you should definitely watch that first. With that said, let's dive deeper into Warzone Eternal. Let's start with how you assemble your force by creating an example army at 30 DP, which is slightly smaller than the standard game size of 40 DP. First, you have to select your faction, and we'll be using Imperial today. Then both players roll off to determine allegiance. Let's see. Our opponent gets a 3 with the red die, while we get a 5 with the white die. The player with the lowest result will be the Agents of Light, which means that our Imperial soldiers are the Servants of Darkness today. This means that we may, but are not required to, spend up to 20% of our DP on allies from the Dark Legion faction that have the Dark Cult designation. In our case, that would be a maximum of 6 DP. We also gain access to specific secondary objectives, but more on that later in the video. If you're familiar with the lore of Mutant Chronicles, you might be worried that your Brotherhood force would end up being the Servants of Darkness. But they actually detract 10 from the Allegiance roll, while the Dark Legion adds 10 to their roll. Now we can start adding units to the force. The first requirement we must adhere to is the inclusion of at least one unit with the Leader designation. At launch, Imperial has 3 different units to choose from: a Blood Beret leader, a Golden Lion leader, and a Trencher leader. Let's go with the Blood Beret leader today for a cost of 5 DP. As you can see on the card, taking this leader also requires one additional Blood Beret unit in your force, and that Blood Beret must have the Trooper designation. So we'll simply add a Blood Beret Trooper for 4 DP to meet that requirement. This is actually a legal force now, but we still have 21 DP left to spend. One thing to consider is the command ability, which pretty much all leaders have. Our leader can command other Blood Berets, but there are leaders who can command several unit types or even their entire faction. Command is an action where the leader performs a test with his leadership as the target number. If successful, a friendly unit of the corresponding type within 12 inches may perform one action when the leader completes its activation. In other words, that unit gets to perform an extra action that turn, which can be really powerful. So let's add another Blood Beret with a better weapon that our leader can command on the battlefield: a Blood Beret RPG. This unit has the support designation, which means that besides the 4 DP, it also costs 2 SP to field. Luckily, our Blood Beret leader gave us 3 support points to use, so we have enough to spend on this unit. It would also be nice to have a specialist in the army, so let's choose a Golden Lion operator at 4 DP. Not only does he have a cool weapon that you saw in the demo, but he also carries different grenades which can be handy. And because of his tactical ability, he's especially good at controlling and holding objectives. Just like with leaders, a specialist requires a number of equivalent troopers in your force, so we need to add a Golden Lion trooper at 4 DP as well. Now we have 9 DP left, and there are several options on how to finish off the force. We could go for another leader and maybe a support unit to add even more punch. Or we could bring in some Dark Cult units as allies. We could also use up to 10% of our DP for faction assets. In our case, that's a maximum of 3 DP, which we can spend on abilities and special equipment, both general and ones that are exclusive to Imperial. But we also have to consider the number of units in our force, and right now we only have 5 models. Half of the scenarios in the rulebook feature objective counters, so you often need to spread out across the battlefield to capture these. If we want to max out our numbers, the cheapest Imperial unit at launch is the Trencher Trooper, which only costs 3 DP. They also have the group ability, which means they're deployed together and also allows us to activate several of them at the same time as a single activation. Adding 3 of these trenchers brings us to 30 DP, and we have a complete force. We have actually built the Imperial starter box right now. These boxes have forces that are ready to use right away, but you could always customize them to suit your playstyle. Maybe drop 1 trencher and add 3 faction assets? It's up to you. There are 4 scenarios available for Warzone Eternal at launch. These are chosen by a die roll and determine how victory points work for the game. These points can be scored by the players from turn 2 onwards, with an extra point available at turn 5 just before the game ends. Let's have a quick look at the scenarios. In Lead from the Front, you need to nominate one of your leaders as a commander and move him as far away as possible from the side where you deployed. But be careful not to let him be outpaced by your other units or get killed by the enemy. In Breakthrough, you have to move as much of your force as possible onto the opponent's half of the battlefield, preferably all the way to the deployment zone. Deny the enemy doing the same by engaging them or halting their progress. In Key Positions, you must attempt to capture the 3 objectives along the center line. Hold more objectives than your enemy to score points, but think hard about which of them to select as your secret primary objective. Finally, in Sabotage, you must move your force into the enemy's half of the battlefield and cause as much damage to their objectives as possible. But don't forget to defend your own from the enemy's attacks as well. Each force must also secretly choose 2 secondary objectives for the battle from a list of 8. Half of these are general, and the other half are divided between the Agents of Light and the Servants of Darkness. The secondary objectives grant you more ways to score victory points, and players reveal their choices simultaneously before deployment. Let's have a quick look at these as well. For Escort, you must reach a model placed on the center line and bring that model back to your deployment zone, or even better, all the way off the table on that side. For flanking maneuvers, at least one of your units must move into one of the edges of the enemy's deployment zone. This pairs nicely with the Breakthrough scenario. For Hold Ground, you must ensure that there are no enemy units in the vicinity of your deployment area. For Intercept Transmissions, you must reach an objective marker in the opponent's half of the battlefield and successfully interact with it. Now we move on to the objectives exclusive to the Agents of Light. For acceptable casualties, your goal is to try and keep as many of your units alive until the end of the game, with a higher percentage resulting in more victory points. For Sacrifice, your troopers must strive to engage with enemy units that are worth more DP than themselves, while surviving long enough to score. Finally, we have the objectives exclusive to the Servants of Darkness. For Send a Message, you gain points each time one of your leaders kills an enemy unit in melee. And for Slaughter, you must kill 2 or more enemy units that are worth more DP than what you yourself lost that turn. As you can see, the combination of which scenario is rolled and how you and your opponent choose your secondary objectives will result in a range of different battles. So try to build a force that is tactically flexible and find strategies on how you can score as many victory points as possible each turn, while also denying the enemy their chance to complete objectives. In our quick demo, the units on the table performed several different actions and reactions. But let's take a look at the rest of the available choices, starting with actions. Brace can be used by a unit carrying a burst weapon, like a light or heavy machine gun. These weapons have the recoil ability, which imposes a penalty to the target number when shooting with them. Using a brace action not only allows the unit to ignore the recoil modifier, but also gives the weapon the suppressive ability, which means that the targeted unit automatically gets a pinned counter. Besides the normal move action, a unit can also climb up or down a vertical surface, but its movement is halved when doing so. It's okay for a unit to end its activation mid-climb, but be aware that if the unit receives a pinned or wounded counter at that stage, it will fall down. If the distance fallen is more than half of the unit's movement rating, it must take an armor test with a damage equal to triple the height. If a unit has the flight special ability, they can use the fly action. This allows them to move or charge up to double their movement rating, ignoring terrain features and intervening units. Like we talked about earlier, it's common to have scenario objectives on the battlefield. A unit can use the interact action while in base-to-base contact with these, which will result in different effects depending on the scenario or secondary objectives chosen. Let's move on to reactions now. We mentioned that if the Golden Lion operator wasn't pinned, he could have performed a counterattack reaction after being struck by the Sunset Striker, allowing him to strike back. But a counterattack can also be used after an enemy unit has shot at you, which allows your unit to shoot back, as long as its weapon is within range, of course. So keep this in mind when one of your units is targeted. Is it better to instantly dive for cover and try to survive the attack, like the Free Marine did? Or do you feel confident your unit will not be harmed and therefore wait to declare a counterattack afterwards? The choice is yours. Next up, we have the ambush reaction, which is actually only available to units that haven't been activated yet. At any point during the movement of an enemy unit, one of your units that has line of sight to the enemy and is not engaged can declare an ambush. The enemy immediately has to halt its move at this point, and your unit receives both a reaction counter and an activation counter. What happens next is that your unit either performs a shoot or a charge action, targeting the halted enemy unit. So in our demo, the Golden Lion operator could have taken a shot at the Sunset Striker or even charged him first. Maybe that could have pinned or even killed the enemy. But the Golden Lion operator would have to skip his entire turn after finishing that ambush. So you have to consider what is most useful. Also, keep in mind that if the enemy survives, it may complete its movement and finish its activation. If one of your units is engaged with a powerful enemy, you might want to use a move action to get away from close combat. However, the enemy unit can then declare a parting blow reaction, which allows it to perform a strike action against the fleeing unit. So unless the enemy is pinned or has already used a reaction counter, you should be aware of the dangers of moving away from melee. Oh, and talking about the deadliness of close combat, it's really bad for a unit to be engaged with multiple enemies. For each of these engaged enemies, a strike action performed against the unit gets a +1 modifier. And likewise, the weapon gets +1 to the damage as well. Ouch. You'll just have to hope that the enemy rolls a critical fail. In melee, this results in a pinned counter as opposed to the reload counter for shooting that we saw in the demo. And you might be wondering about units that don't carry any weapons that can be used in close combat, like this Chaucer from the Cybertronic faction. Well, he can still strike an enemy in melee, but there is no modifier for the test. If the strike is successful, use the unit's strength as the damage for the attack. I also wanted to talk a little more about the defense rating of units. In our demo, we only encountered units with defense 0, which didn't affect any of the tests. But if you're targeting a Brotherhood Mortificator, you'll have to deduct 2 from the target number, representing how agile and well-trained they are. And if you're targeting the monstrous Razide, you actually get to add 2 to your target number, since the lumbering hulks are easy to hit. So keep in mind that defense ratings can be both positive and negative for your units. Besides blocking line of sight, the scenery pieces in Warzone Eternal can have one or more terrain traits. Players should agree on which traits each terrain feature has before the start of the game. Let's take a quick look at the 10 different terrain traits. If a terrain feature has ladders, ropes, or something similar, it is climbable. This enables units to use the climb action here. A robust and dense piece of terrain can offer cover. If a unit receives heavy obstruction from it, that unit gets a 2+ bonus to its armor rating. A dangerous terrain feature can harm units that come into contact with it or begin any movement within. If such a unit fails a leadership test, it suffers a damage 7 hit. A terrain feature may also be destructible as per certain special rules. An enclosed piece of terrain is an intact structure with walls, a roof, and one or more entry points. If there are only enemy units inside, a leadership test must be passed in order to enter the space. Some terrain is simply impossible to move through in any way and should have the impassable trait. Rubble or underbrush can be difficult to move through. Such features count as rough, and units moving through these must have their movement rating. If there is a specific weapon modeled on the terrain piece, it counts as having a weapon mount. The weapon can be used for 1 activation per turn if a unit is in contact with it. An area of similar terrain, like a field of rubble, counts as a zone. That means that all of its additional terrain traits are based on the boundaries of its footprint rather than physical elements within. As an example, this entire zone could count as rough. A variant of this is the zone dense trait, like this cluster of trees. A unit fully within counts as always having heavy obstruction. In addition, if the line of sight passes through 2 inches or more of the zone, it is considered blocked. Well, I think that covers most of the rules we didn't encounter in the first video. Check out the links in the description and pinned comment below if you're interested in the game, and download the rules and unit cards for yourself. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on future content. A special thank you to Arnold over on Patreon. And if you want to go that extra mile and get some nice perks while helping us out, all our links are in the description below. We'll see you next time. Good luck with your miniatures.